Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Legal Cheek podcast, which is sponsored by Simpson Thatcher, home of the private equity training contract. I'm Alex Aldridge, the publisher of Legal Cheek, and with me is one of our writers, Julia Szaniszlo. Julia, I realise I've never really pronounced your surname before.
No, not
I
many
saw it as
people
in the
have.
intro, and I thought, oh no, was that correct?
Yeah, that was actually first
Okay,
time someone got it right on the first go. Everyone gets
okay,
tripped up.
I should have just styled it out. Um, the theme of today's podcast is commercial awareness. We had the Legal Cheek Summer Virtual Vacation Scheme last week, and I did a presentation on that about kind of an introduction to commercial awareness. And there's a couple of kind of things that I wanted to kind of build on from that. So one of the things that just struck me as I was doing the presentation was just kind of how much some students who want to become lawyers tend to kind of overcomplicate the concept of commercial awareness. And then I thought as well, Julia, about your journey is such a good example of someone you've never even studied law, right? But
No.
you've obtained a training contract at a top US firm in London, from doing a non-law degree. And I suppose since you started working at Legal Cheek, presenting a lot of our events, really kind of you've seen like your commercial awareness develop so well, and I suppose it's such a good kind of case study of kind of someone who, despite never studying law, has kind of really got to grips with the commercial legal market.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
And so we're going to talk a little bit about Julia's journey in this podcast. But it was just doing the talk on the VAC scheme. It was kind of it's like a kind of big week, I suppose, for kind of business news with the SpaceX IPO taking place last week. And that's such an attractive story if you're someone who's kind of on the beginning of your journey to being a corporate lawyer, and you think, okay, I want to develop my commercial awareness. I mean, what kind of more accessible story of that is there to kind of get in this mad IPO, which is kind of based on essentially going to Mars, I think, for it to pay off. Or having all these like data centers on satellites floating around Earth. It's such a kind of so accessible and so interesting, and it kind of led me into like explaining the journey from being a startup business all the way to doing an IPO, initial public offering. So going from being a private business to a publicly listed company. And obviously, as myself, of someone who has started a business and kind of grown it, it's not quite SpaceX. I'm not sure we'll be doing an IPO anytime soon. But it's gone from like just me to like 10 employees. Roughly goes up and down a bit, and we've developed a good business, and so I suppose, obviously, not every student who's going to try and be a lawyer is going to start a business. And I think probably the best way to develop your commercial awareness would be actually to start a business. But people don't have time to do that. But yeah, just as I was sort of talking through that, it just occurred to me, it was just how because there's like endless like business news stories, just there's so much jargon, and it's not like I understand everything, but kind of over the last, I suppose, 20 years since I've been a journalist and 15 years doing Legal Cheek, I've got a really kind of decent understanding of the business world, but it's very much a kind of I suppose it's a kind of journalist's understanding of like, you don't understand everything in depth. In fact, you don't understand almost anything in depth, but you understand the basics and you kind of understand how it all fits together. And I suppose that's really what students have to do. Um, and um, and yeah, one of the things I was sort of talking about on my talk, it just was not a planned bit, but there was some comment about coffee or something, and I realised I was drinking oh yeah, I was talking about how it's really important to understand that law is a service industry, and again, which is no real difference than serving coffee in Starbucks. It's heart of it, like doing a good job for your customers, and how kind of law students sometimes think, because law is quite a complicated thing to study, they think like, you know, that it can't be as simple as just doing a good job for your client, where it actually is. And then we're sort of talking about how the Starbucks, you know, I can't remember, you know, how kind of big companies grow and then kind of decay, and it's kind of this life cycle of, you know, and Starbucks is a good example of a company that has done an IPO. You can buy shares in Starbucks, probably as a consequence of Starbucks being so big. Its coffee is actually not, personally, I don't think it's very nice. I kind of try and avoid Starbucks coffee. And I looked, and I was, as I was doing my presentation, which is an online presentation, I had just like a cup of coffee from like an independent coffee place, which I'd deliberately gone to because the coffee is a lot nicer than Starbucks. And that's a small business, and there's a gap in the market because the big company's not producing very nice coffee, so they can kind of come up as this kind of specialty coffee company that's nicer coffee, and then they can grow and they can get more shops, and as they get more shops, they're going to need legal advice about leases and employment law advice about hiring people. And you know, that's what lawyers do. They're there kind of supporting these companies on this journey. And this little cafe that I've been to, it grows a bit, and then it might get external investment. So you'd need lawyers coming in. I mean, making sure everyone's, you know, it's all the paperwork's correct on the investment. Everyone gets the right stake in the business, the right amount of money. Obviously, you need lawyers for this. It would keep growing and growing. And eventually it would do its IPO, like Starbucks before it, like SpaceX, and it would need its prospectus, which is kind of like a sales document for like potential investors, like members of the public, like us. We could buy some shares in it, and lawyers would work on that because that's what corporate lawyers do, and they help draft the prospectus and make sure it's all kind of correct, and I suppose like a revelation for me is sort of a small business owner, and who myself has worked with lawyers a fair bit as the business has grown, on everything from, you know, kind of media law, defamation, to employment law, etc., etc. And it's just how this stuff is almost more simple than you realize. And so rather than like try and understand like the really complex elements of, you know, what I mean, I'm sure you could drill down into an IPO and just get completely lost in the detail and just be completely baffled. Or you could zoom out a little bit and just see it in the context of a story of a small company becoming a big company, and lawyers helping it along the way. And I think having you know, just kind of witnessing that journey and being on my own journey and doing this, kind of now I'm at the time, and I realized that the world is almost simpler than I could have thought it possibly could have been when I would have been in my early 20s, at the same sort of age that many people are applying for training contracts. I've been speaking for a lot. I wanted now, Julia, your take. Would you say, because that's me gaining this knowledge over like 2 decades. What about you, who's gained this knowledge over like 9 months?
I mean, I don't know. I think you're really right. People tend to think that just because law is a very academic subject at university, you get lost in the weeds of precedents and case law and whatnot, that automatically translates into the practice of law. And the thing that I've really learned, it's sort of two-pronged, is that on the one hand, um, it's a completely different beast to work in an industry rather than to study it. You're going to be working to tighter deadlines, working with clients who want things clearly, they want things quickly, they just want to get on with their life. And you are at the end of the day a facilitator in that process, whether that's helping them with a dispute of some kind when things have gone wrong, or helping them achieve some sort of goal which might actually be really exciting and really big, like an IPO. And in order to understand that, I had to understand how businesses work. And this was something I had no experience in beyond just like very basic things. Oh, interest rates go up, more expensive to borrow money. I didn't really know or understand any of this terminology. So I think that was the biggest and the steepest learning curve for me. But yeah, simplifying it works. I remember in one of my earliest applications to a law firm, I think it was to White and Case, they asked everyone to talk about some sort of issue or commercial issue in one of the recent deals. And I picked like a telecoms one that had some kind of foreign direct investment implications. And I just went way too deep rather than just thinking about the basic fact that if you're getting money from a foreign jurisdiction, it's harder to understand where it's coming from, and there may be national security risks. Like, that's as simple as it is, and that makes
Yeah.
sense it's so much easier if you think about it, if you just try and explain it like you're explaining it to a 12-year-old or something, because they'll actually, it really can just be that simple. Um, but yeah, for me, it was the speed at which I had to get up to date with all of this terminology. That was the hardest thing. And suddenly having to sound not like an expert, but like a competent enough authority during like the events that we run. When, in the first few weeks, we had one on private equity secondaries. And I just remember I researched it. I researched that topic for like 3 hours because I was like, I don't even know what private equity is. Like, not really, not
Yeah.
genuinely. But I think that whilst it may have been my job to do such a thing, I think the way in which I went about it can be, other people can do it too. You can do that as just a regular student. If
Yeah.
you're applying to law firms, you've got a couple of hours, then the way in which I researched, I think, is what yeah, made it very effective. And the sort of frequency with which I did it and the consistency. I think it's all just consistency, just doing it.
Again and again, and just
Yeah.
you're forced to do it, so you put yourselves in those. I suppose
Yeah.
it's a vulnerable position. I mean, it reminds me of what you're saying of one of our team who's now a journalist at Financial News. He's been at the Telegraph, the lawyer, and I remember when he just joined us, he he's like you. He was like trying to do all the research into it, and I was like, Adam, you're not doing a speech for an hour about this.
Yeah,
Just facilitating a discussion. You're not the expert.
exactly.
You just have to have the basics, and that's very much a principle in journalism, which is a really useful principle and kind of comforting principle, because otherwise it would be impossible. And
Yeah.
I think it's a very useful principle in life generally, and particularly for students who are trying to get into law and get training contracts. That's a really good way of looking at it. And you mentioned kind of like some of the stuff so complicated, like where do you start and how do you do it? And I think there's a really good principle on you've kind of got to get the basics first, and then you kind of layer
Mm,
on the complexity.
yeah.
And if you don't do if you get that order the wrong way round and you go to complexity first, you kind of get lost. Um,
Oh, yeah, yeah. I did that in one of my interviews, actually. If you don't mind me interrupting, it just made me think of it. In my VAC scheme interview, we were given a case study and we had to go through it. And this was in January. So I'd say by this point I was already getting there, I would say. I was decent enough in terms of my commercial awareness, but it was about electric car batteries or something like that. It was fairly interesting, but that wasn't the point. When I went in to talk about it with the partner, they asked me, right, so what are your thoughts? And I immediately went into some really weird granular detail about something that I can't remember, to the point that midway through the conversation, the partner asked me, yeah, but how are we going to finance this? And I was like, oh, of course, right, yeah. That's
Yeah.
what they're thinking about. They're thinking about where they're going to get the money from and how they're going to use it, to actually buy this. I think it was a processing plant or something. It was some infrastructure deal. And here I was talking about competition implications. They're like, frankly, we don't give a toss. Yeah, we want to hear about the money. And yeah, that's it. Just don't overcomplicate it. Luckily, it all still worked out. They could have just sent me on my way because I didn't have, common sense. I think that's
Yeah.
what it is. It's common sense. If just boil it down to what it fundamentally is, rather than trying to add all of these
Yeah.
complicated bells and whistles.
Yeah. It's because yeah, like you say, that the partners at the law firm you're going to speak to, they're going to be more concerned with sort of very practical concerns, aren't they? Like, just
Yeah.
how do you get from A to B? I think a lot more than students realize. I think sometimes students would think they're kind of like these sort of sages of wisdom in these, doing these kind of like magical spells involving the law and stuff.
Yes.
And that, yeah, they're really not. They're interested in a practical way. And like you say, common sense, but I think it kind of sometimes it requires like a certain level of confidence
Oh yeah.
to be
Yeah.
able to say, you know what, I just what this person is asking is quite simple, and it does boil down to common sense. And I think often students don't really have the confidence to kind of realize it's simpler than they think. They think it just can't possibly be.
Yeah. No,
Um,
exactly.
I suppose the trick, it's all very well, sort of saying you've got to get the basics first and then layer on the complexity. And it's a very sound principle, but sometimes it's even hard to know what the basics are. And I thought when you gave the example of private equity, right? It's like,
Mm.
what even is that?
Yeah.
And it's like that, for me, that would be a really good example of something. I know the basics of what it is. I know what it means. But if you ask me to really define it in like mega detail, I couldn't.
Yeah.
And the way I describe that is the way I see this is that before 2008, the 2008 financial crisis, which I know is a long time and away from like today's students, but it is an important thing. Banks used to do like loads of risky lending with all this kind of exotic lending products, blah, blah, blah. There was a massive financial crisis. It almost bankrupted the whole banking system that they were doing this kind of lending. And a lot of the more interesting exotic elements of the financial sector moved from banks to basically private equity, inverted commas. So kind of this non-bank lending.
Mm.
And then you have this idea of like equity index. Obviously, like private equity, it's originally it's the idea of just people with lots of money, not even borrowing money, just financing stuff with loads of money. But now you've got elements of private equity, which is debt funded and blah blah blah, and it's this shadow banking system which has got more and more complicated as time has gone on. And then you see the law firms that were kind of in with the private equity houses when they were much smaller. They are now the biggest law firms in the world, like Kirkland & Ellis, Latham Watkins, etc. And the law firms that were really kind of in with the banks pre 2008 financial crisis, their growth has been much more kind of stagnant. And so, I couldn't go into detail on what that is. And sure, if I'm applying for a private equity training contract, indeed, this podcast is sponsored by Simpson Thacher, which has recently launched its private equity training contract. And you really should, if you're going to go for a private equity training contract, or aim for a firm that does a lot of private equity, whatever, you probably need a better understanding of private equity than me. But first, I think you've really got to understand the basics of it, as I've just outlined, and kind of where it fits into the wider market, and then you can layer on that complexity. And indeed, Julia, you're kind of so how did you kind of get to grips with these kind of concepts? How did you avoid doing the complexity before the basics?
I don't know if I quite avoided it. There were definitely periods before I joined Legal Cheek where I overcomplicated it and then gave up, which was not very good. I think one of the books I read, which you can't always have a one-stop shop solution to everything. It's sitting on my shelf right now. It's everything, or all you need to know about the city, which just gives you a nice introduction to the financial world. Because at the end of the day, if you're gunning for these big city contracts, I mean, I'm not saying that everyone is, but if you are, then that's the world that you're going to be immersed in, because law firms are part of that ecosystem in the way that investment banks are. And so you need to understand how they all interact. But yeah, just understanding a few key concepts I would try and understand are debt, interest rates, just how money sort of flows, the kinds of things that'll affect like a stock exchange. I didn't understand what it really meant for, you know, things to go up and down in value on the stock exchange and why that would happen. And what I didn't realize was that, you know, there's literally just this class of investors who see that a company is doing particularly badly. Maybe they're, I don't know, they've been affected by some sort of scandal. I'm thinking something completely random. And they're like, oh, they're not going to do very well for the next couple of years because this scandal means that people aren't going to want to interact with them as a business because they're going to have reservations about them ethically or whatever. I don't know. That's just an example. So I'm going to perhaps pull my investment, but I'm going to buy back my shares that, you know, and boom, it's just immediately going to cause a massive issue. And this all works together. And I still wouldn't say that I understand it perfectly, but just understanding that system, I think, is the most important one to start with because everything bleeds from that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I that book is a really good one. Ryan, another one of our writers, also read it when he was starting out, and he also has a training contract now. Not saying it's going to solve all of your problems. And then another thing I would do is not necessarily read the FT every day because you can't. It's written for specialists. It's very long. You probably don't have time for it. And you'll likely just not understand things when you first start reading about the financial world. But you know, listening to their daily news podcast is a really good way to start, and just interrogating words that you hear that you aren't familiar with. If you constantly hear the words interest rates, for instance, and you don't know what they are, go and Google them, and that's fine. And there will be some things that will be too complicated for you to understand, but that's fine. It's a process of
Yeah.
trial and error.
Yeah.
And also, there's lots of really interesting stuff on YouTube these days. I think people forget that it's a very useful resource. Loads of traditional news outlets use it as a way to publish slightly longer form content, which can be quite interesting. There are lots of, I would call them satirical financial educators on there that, you know, I would not listen to everything that they say, but you can use them as a jumping off point. There was one YouTube channel that I started listening to, which was more of a humorous channel called Good Work, but he does like these really funny videos that are like 15 minutes long on different sectors, like what is investment banking or what do investment bankers actually do? Because I didn't know until recently. So understanding these key players is a good place to go, but actually ignore the law. Yeah, just ignore
Yeah.
the law for the first bit of your research into commercial awareness because it's not really the point of, you know, commercial awareness. The legal doctrines and law, they govern how this all works. They put rules in place and they make sure things don't go off the rails completely, in theory, or they can restrict things too much. You know, you hear the words regulation and over-regulation all the time in the news these days. But they're just, yeah, they're facilitators
Yeah.
or blockages, you know, some would say. They're not the things that are keeping things moving in that sense. I'm not sure if that it's a bit rambly. It was
Yeah,
a
no,
very
I think that's
area.
there's some great advice there. I think that you say ignore the law. That's you are right, because you've got to kind of figure out where the law fits into it,
Yeah.
but it's not it's not kind of law led. If it's part of the understanding, kind of the fact that law's a service industry. They're not setting the agenda in that way. They're providing support.
Yeah.
Um,
Like, yeah, exactly. Like the private credit thing and so the post, what Alex was talking about post 2008. It wasn't that the lawyers came up with all of that. That was these, private, private credit banks, they're not really banks, filling a gap in the market because banks weren't willing to lend in a risky way. So they were like, okay, we're here, we can do that. And we're going to need lawyers to help us set up the
yeah,
documents. That's where the lawyers came in. And that's why places like Kirkland and Ellis are doing so great, because they saw that and they thought, we're going to go ahead and get in on that action. And I guess that's what I learned about private equity secondaries, because that's, the private equity industry, if you've been following the news, it's been having some issues recently, because very briefly, what they do is they'll buy companies, these houses, and then hold them for a bit, and then they'll sell them again, usually for a profit. But because the environment hasn't been too good, they haven't been able to sell, so they're just holding on to these companies. So what do? We need to figure out a solution to give money back to all of our investors or keep them all happy. Otherwise, they're going to start banging down our door and demanding their cash back. But we need legal structures to help us with this. And
yeah,
that's where secondaries come in.
yeah, yeah. I think it's a sort of subtle point about where lawyers kind of sit in the kind of commercial ecosystem, but very rarely do they set the agenda. They're providing support. I mean, sometimes you might have, say, I mean, it's very different context, but say you've got a Supreme Court making a major decision, and that would set the agenda. That would set a kind of a rule for society to follow. But mostly when it comes to corporate law, no, it's much more responding to the actions of others, and like you say, some of those law firms finding a good gap in the market.
Mm.
I think just in terms of sort of book recommendations, that's another thing that I mentioned in my talk, and I've heard about. What was the name of that book you mentioned, Julia?
Oh, all you need to know about the
All you
city.
need to know about the city,
Yeah,
because
by Christopher
I've met
Smith.
that guy. He's a former Hogan Lovells lawyer, and I've never actually read the book, but it's meant to be really good.
Yeah,
Um,
very
the,
short. Very short.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the ones that I recommended for sort of commercial awareness was I really like the Shoe Dog, which is like the story of the founder of Nike, and it's
Oh,
a great Phil Knight or something, Phil something, but Shoe Dog, if you Google it,
yeah.
and it's just such a good story because he's just so fun. Starting Nike was just like such a crazy journey, and
Yeah.
it's just such a page turner, and yeah, you think about the life cycle of a company from this sort of startup, which often really sort of it's just someone who's following a passion and
Yeah.
then ends up becoming this massive company. It's such a good book. And then there's like it was a novel that I mentioned, White Tiger, which is it's kind of very very different, but it's or is it Aravinda Adiga, which I always think is just a great story of kind of which I'd recommend. And then the TV show I mentioned, Breaking Bad, of like building I mean it's an illegal drugs business and it doesn't end very well, and
Yeah.
you're not going to have an IPO, but it, I think it does capture to a certain extent that story of the kind of fun and excitement of building a business.
Mm. Oh,
um
I've got two more recommendations. One of them was given to me. It's a classic that I'd heard of, but I hadn't really opened it yet. So I'm reading it right now. It's called Barbarians at the Gate, which is about, I think
I
that's,
actually read that. Yeah, it's good.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
good so far.
yeah,
And that's about the leverage buyout of, was it RJR, so the tobacco
yeah,
company.
yeah.
Um, and it was written by investigative journalists, so it's really gripping. My one of the recruitment partners at the firm was really gunning for that book at a dinner. He was telling me it was the best book he's ever read. Okay, that's a bit dramatic, but it is good. And then, not to toot their horn again, but if you haven't watched The Big Short yet as an aspiring corporate lawyer, what are you doing? Because it is really good at explaining things because they have these cutaways. I don't know if you agree, Alex, but these cutaways where like a celebrity will explain like a
Yeah,
concept,
yeah, it's
and
great.
it's great. It's
Yeah.
just, yeah, go watch
Yeah,
that.
and it's such a good story, isn't it? It's such a
Exactly.
great film. Yeah, so I mean, that's a nice way to start. I mean, at the kind of beginning of the podcast, mentioned like the SpaceX IPO is like such an exciting thing.
Yeah.
It's just such a golden opportunity to get interested in that world. And I suppose like these kind of films and books that we're mentioning again, they're just like wonderful stories. And that's the way to get into something, not be like, oh God, I've got to learn what 20 terms mean today, and then you just to kind of getting towards the end, but I suppose like in the age of AI, right, everyone can have like amazing facts, right? What's hard to get is the kind of being able to contextualize stuff and have that broad understanding. That's where the premium is, and I think that's what you get from like stories,
Mm.
and that's the stuff that's going to get you in. So certainly I think that's the place to be if you kind of if you're going to want to improve your commercial awareness.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's Julia, you're a great example of someone who's done it, kind of in like 9 months, like really kind of gone from not a massive understanding to like really 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 good understanding, and I suppose putting yourself in, chairing many of our events, putting yourself in very bravely challenging situations and just forcing yourself to learn, and it's paid off. And
Yeah.
you're starting your PGDL in the autumn.
Quite soon. Yeah, it pays off. Just consistency and being a bit brave, I think. Not everyone can chair a legal cheek event, that's for sure. But everyone can try and learn something new.
I think everyone can like read
Yeah, exactly.
like Shoe Dog. You could buy Shoe Dog and read Shoe Dog, or get out of the library or whatever. That for me would be a good, or a book, or what that's the starting point. Just to mention on the FT just quickly, like, 'cause I think you have some good student subscriptions. Well, I do think some of the FT stories are very accessible, and the comments are great. Like
Oh,
you've got
that's so true. Yeah.
comments really good. Whereas if you go on like Bloomberg, they're good articles, but it's like you don't have the comments. And whereas I love the FT comments, and that again is a way of kind of a bit more accessible stuff. And you don't have to read everything, just pick the things you're interested in alongside the other things we've talked about, and you won't go far wrong. So just a reminder that the Legal Cheek podcast is sponsored by Simpson Thacher, home of the private equity training contract. Simpson Thacher, one of the biggest law firms in the world, has just launched its all new private equity training contract in London. I think there's about 10 training places the firm is recruiting for in this cycle. We've got a story about it on Legal Cheek, the exclusive story, which we ran earlier this week. As you'd expect, they're paying top of the market rates. There's going to be quite a lot of excitement, I think, about one of the kind of biggest law firms in the world kind of moving into the training contract market in London. So yeah, thank you to them for their sponsorship, and we will see you soon.
Bye.